Hey there, psychology students, Professor Zeeb here, and welcome to another online lecture. This time we're going to talk about something that's pretty sensitive and probably something a lot of people don't want to talk about, but it is part of our course, so we are going to cover it, and that is violence and aggression, okay? So let's go to our slides here, and then we'll kind of start. Okay, so it turns out that, as you probably know, violence and aggression have really been part of humans' history forever. In fact, if you look back in history, this was probably a big part of uh, protecting and getting resources and things like that. So it is something, unfortunately, that's been part of our history going back to probably the beginning of time. However, we're going to look at it from a psychological standpoint, some things that we know that are linked to violence and aggression, some reasons why we get upset, that kind of thing. Okay, so let's get to it. So one of the things that our textbook talks about and psychologists talk about is called the frustration aggression hypothesis. In other words, one of the reasons we get aggressive is due to frustration. This was first brought about by John Dollard way back in 1939. So this is a classic theory. So once again, as the name implies, frustration leads to aggression. In other words, anger, violence is often caused by some type of obstacle that causes frustration. Something is getting in our way and it's making us mad, and it possibly leads to an aggressive type behavior. In other words, something is standing in the way of doing something or obtaining something, which, as it turns out, drives us crazy. I don't know about you guys, but I kind of feel that way sometimes, where you're trying to do something and something is preventing you from doing it, and it just makes you absolutely mad. And unfortunately, some people, it can lead to these sort of unfortunate consequences. To me, the classic example of that is traffic. I mean, obviously, we want to go where we want to go, and when traffic stands in our way, it's a big bummer, right? We don't like that, and quite frankly, this is probably what leads to road rage, unfortunately, sometimes. So there are some psychologists that believe that aggression often stems from some type of frustration. Something is preventing us from doing what we want, or it's making us upset, which seems sort of obvious. Obviously, aggression is related to the fight or flight response, or fight or flee response, depending on who you ask here. And so we know through research and studies that unpleasant events activates the fight or flight response. So obviously you probably have heard of this before, where it's a part of our nervous system where we stand up and fight or we run away. It's almost like an innate reaction that we have based on the autonomic nervous system. So we know that circumstances, sometimes environmental events, can influence the expression of this. In other words, something that you're experiencing or a situation that you're currently involved in can activate the fight or flight response, which can lead to aggression. I mean, that could be pain, that could be when someone insults you, or you're in some kind of competitive situation. There's many different areas and examples of that. In fact, we know that crowding, research has revealed that crowding often leads to aggression, and theoretically, it's activating our fight or flight response. So to me, the classic example of this one, I don't know if you guys have ever experienced this before, but that's of course, the Black Friday crowds. You guys have heard of Black Friday. I've never personally been involved in something like this, but apparently things can get kind of nasty during the Black Friday events, where people get really competitive and upset, and sometimes it leads to things like trampling or fights and disturbance and things like that. So that is a classic example of an environmental factor that we're in, where we're all trying to get this item, and there's a lot of competitive buyers out there, and a lot of emotions are running high. And this could possibly explain why people get pissed off, people get upset, and possibly turn to aggression in these circumstances, as it gets our emotions going and our fight or flight response activated. Okay, So now we're going to kind of turn the page and go on to our next topic. So based on research, they have found some individual differences in aggression. In other words, obviously not everyone's an aggressive person. There are some people that are more prone to it than others. So what is it about them, those people that are aggressive, that sort of, possibly influences them to be that way? That's kind of what we're looking at, all right? So they have found that there are personality factors linked to aggression. So this comes from a study by Settles et al. In 2012, where they found particular personality factors linked to aggression. Now, guys, just as a sort of a heads up, this kind of goes to our next chapter, chapter 14, and it refers to the Big Five model of personality. So hopefully, maybe you've looked ahead at that. If not, it might be helpful to do so at this point. But this theory basically states that there are 5 main personality factors or traits, okay? So to kind of relate it here, the combination, they found that this particular combination has been linked to aggression in people, okay? So number 1, being low in agreeableness, they have found has been linked to aggression. Being low in conscientiousness, once again, this is drawing from that Big Five theory, so low in conscientiousness, and then being high in what we call neuroticism. So that unique combination, let's say that again, being low in agreeableness, low in conscientiousness, and high in neuroticism seems to be the sort of recipe for disaster and is more linked to aggression than other personality styles. So they found that particular combination seems to be critical. They've also found a connection between aggression and low self-esteem. Research shows that people who feel bad about themselves often feel better putting other people down. Does that kind of make sense? Maybe it's like a power thing or a dominance thing, but we have found that in research. Now, before we sort of jump to conclusions here, there are mixed results connected to this. The studies have found a very small effect, if any, in connection to this. In other words, low self-esteem does not necessarily cause aggression. I guess it can in certain circumstances, but we can't sort of blanket that to everyone. So it does not cause aggression. And the studies have really had trouble finding a causal factor to that. So in other words, they're loose at best. There's probably other factors in play that may explain that. So we got to be careful with that. But there are some psychologists believe there is a connection to that. Other psychologists feel that it may be a threat to your self-confidence, another possibility here. People who feel powerful, for example, may get aggressive when their self-confidence is threatened. In other words, they want to be on top, and any threat to that position or that feeling of being confident, is looked at as a very negative thing. And so they may take measures to protect that, I guess is kind of what they're saying. So there are some studies that kind of show that connection. Research has also revealed that aggression can be a product of nature and nurture. Going back to those earlier lectures, remember we said that nature is kind of like what you're born with, like genetics would be an example, or nurture would be how you were raised, the environment you grew up in, things you're exposed to, et cetera, et cetera. So when we look at the studies and research, it seems to be a combination of probably both of those, okay? So let's kind of look at a combination. It could be that the person has inherited a genetic predisposition that has been connected to violent factors or aggressive factors. And also, they've also experienced some kind of childhood maltreatment. Okay, so let's take a closer look at this. With this genetic predisposition stuff, researchers have found genes that regulate serotonin. Okay, so that's the neurotransmitter we talked about in chapter 3. And they found that this gene regulates the levels of serotonin. And when they get too low, that is sort of a correlate to being aggressive. So low levels of serotonin, which is linked to that gene, if you follow me, have been linked to aggression. Now, once again, like a lot of these studies, the effects of this are shown in research, but they're very small. So it's not like they found this sort of huge sort of connecting factor. Some of the studies, they're mixed. In other words, they're showing small effects. So you have to be careful with that, but it also leads us to believe that there may be some type of connection. Looking at an environmental variable, research has revealed that witnessing aggression in your own family, as an example, this was by Ferguson and others in 2008 study, they found that witnessing aggressive acts within your own family unit is one of the strongest predictors of violence and aggression. So in other words, the point is that if you inherited this predisposition, as we said, low levels of serotonin, and there's some kind of violence in the home that you've witnessed and experienced or even been involved in, we've found that this is a combination that may be a risk factor for being aggressive or violent later on. Now, remember, that doesn't mean you're going to be, that's not going to cause you to be, but the research is showing that's more than likely, or it's correlated, I should say it that way. There may be some type of connection between that combination. All right, so now we turn back to some research. Now we're going to examine different factors associated with violent behavior. Please keep in mind as we go through these that none of these are causal necessarily, okay? Remember, this data is correlational in nature. It's not like they did studies and found a causal factor related to these. They found correlations. They found links between people who are violent and some of these factors, okay? So keep that in mind. You have to be kind of careful with this. All right, let's go through the list here. Number one, growing up in a violent neighborhood is associated with violent behavior. Having parents with a history of antisocial behavior. In other words, parents that don't necessarily follow the rules of society. They lack guilt, for example, in trouble with the law. It would be a great example of that. So in other words, people that show these antisocial sort of factors, it's been linked to violent behavior. Having a mother who smoked cigarettes or drank alcohol during pregnancy. Now remember, this is not a causal factor. It's not like they did a study where they, had women smoke and drink while they were pregnant and then examine their kids. This is more along the lines of, okay, so they have identified a violent child and then they interviewed the parent and they found this pattern, okay? So this is a correlative factor, obviously. There's some kind of connection between that, but that does not mean that doing those things would lead to violent behavior in your child. Poor nutrition or exposure to lead and other toxic chemicals early in life has been associated with violent behavior. Having a history of head injury, another correlate of violent behavior. You can see there's quite a few here. Not feeling guilty after hurting someone. So they found that violent people who were consistently violent or aggressive often showed this trait. To me, this rings of, once again, that antisocial stuff that we talked about, okay? It's a classic feature of that. So there may be some kind of connection. People who have weak physiological responses. Remember, correlational data doesn't apply to everyone. Having a history of suicide attempts, Looking at more of a physiological factor, high levels of testosterone coupled with low levels of cortisol. Those are both hormones. And so that unique combination of hormones has been correlated to violent behavior. This next one's pretty controversial. Frequently watching violence on TV or playing violent video games has been positively correlated with violent behavior. Now remember, once again, this is not causal. There's been many studies on this that show overwhelmingly show that there is some kind of connection between, especially TV, watching TV, violence on TV, and being violent. But remember, these are not causal studies. These are correlational studies. And in fact, when they try to prove this through causal studies, there has been little effect. However, correlational studies, we have lots of data that show a connection between those two things. So there's a couple ways you could kind of interpret this. So remember, they're saying that, okay, let's focus on the TV here. People that watch violence on TV are often violent. Okay, so the studies are showing that. So this could mean a couple different things. This could mean that watching TV could lead to violence. I mean, I guess that's a possibility and that could happen. Or you could also say that violent people are drawn to violent programming. Does that make sense? In other words, there's something appealing about watching violence on TV to people who are already violent. And of course, that would show up in these type of studies. Okay. So you have to be careful with that. It is definitely correlational type data. It does not mean that this causes that. It just means that they're associated in some way according to what the studies are showing. All right, that will conclude our short lecture here on aggression and violence. I hope you guys have been enjoying the course, and I will see you online.